We're going to go through a wrist flexion, PAILS and rails. So for this, I'm going to demonstrate sitting on a box and also using a slightly lower box. You could use a coffee table, you could also do this standing, so I'm using the floor. I'm going with what I find is most comfortable as a setup to work with. So for wrist flexion, we're going to be bringing our wrist into this position for end range, exploring what is being lengthened around this whole area of our forearm at the same time. So there's a few variables we can use to explore this particular setup. So to begin with, what I'm then going to do is put my wrist over the box like this, and I'm going to have my shoulder slightly in front. So this is quite gentle right now on my wrist. But if I wanted to then lengthen this whole area, I would simply move back. So now what's happening is my shoulders are moving back in relation to my palm in the direction of my fingers. That will start to lengthen this whole area. Now I want you to kind of assess as you do that, because there's a few things you can then manipulate. So rather than just moving back, I can move back in combination with a slight angle, so moving back into the side, and then exploring maybe what particular side gives me a better line of tension. Another very important one is where the elbow pit is pointing. So by manipulating and rotating the elbow pit, that will very much change how this whole area is being lengthened. So as I rotate one way to the other, it will shorten certain areas, lengthen other areas, essentially changing how the tension feels along my whole forearm area here. So that's another variable to play with. Okay, another one is also curling the fingers. So as I curl my fingers as so, I'm also lengthening this region. So that could be also something else to play with. And if you feel that works for you, for the PAILS and rails, you may want to actually get something like a yoga block to help block those fingers in place for when you perform your set, which I'll come to in a little bit. One final modification you can play with is then bending the elbow. So as I'm here, I could also bend the elbow to see how that feels in terms of exploring and looking for lines of tension for wrist flexion and also this forearm region. So if you're looking for an all-round sort of good stretch, play with all those variables, try to find what gives you a good line of tension. If you're working to overall improve that wrist mobility, you may want to perform a few different sets, PAILS and rails in slightly different setups. So I'm going to run through an example of how I would do the PAILS and rails for this. So assuming now that I've found my passive stretch, I've explored, I've found the setup I want, and I've held for a little bit of time. So I'm going to demonstrate also with my fingers flexed to give an example of how I would do this. So I'm here. My PAILS contraction is going to be to try to resist the block with my fingers. So I'm now going to push into this yoga block with my fingers, with my palm here, my hand that's resting against the box. I'm thinking to push against the box as if I was straightening the wrists. And then everything that's being lengthened and put under tension on my forearm, I'm also thinking about contracting to help perform this effort. That will be my PAILS, and then the rails will be the opposite. So I'm going to try and curl these fingers off a bit more. I'm going to contract everything here and also on the other side of my forearm, as if I was trying to actively promote more wrist flexion. So assuming I've held now for a little bit of time, I would then generally start at a mild 10 to 20%, doing, as I said, PAILS contraction, resisting, pushing into a block with my fingers, pushing down with the hand, trying to straighten the wrist, contracting everything on the forearm to make that happen. And then in the space of another, say, 10 to 20 seconds, I build up to my safest, greatest efforts and hold. If I did this with a straight elbow or a bent elbow, I'm trying not to change that elbow position while I'm performing my PAILS and rails contraction. And I'm holding this for approximately 20 seconds, and then I switch. So in 3, 2, 1, I begin to do the opposite. I'm curling my fingers, trying to get them to come off the block, trying to flex the wrist more, trying to contract everything on this side now, essentially trying to hold on to that horse stretch sensation that I had on the other side. I keep that held for 15 to 20 seconds, and then I slowly soften the contraction and then guide slightly deep into the passive stretch. I can play a little bit again with exploring with all the variables I mentioned, and then move into my second round. If I was not using the yoga block and I just had my fingers flat on the box like this, it'd be the same thing. As I built the PAILS contraction, I'd be pushing down into the box with the fingers as I perform the rails. I keep the fingers straight, but I'm still thinking about contracting everything on my fingers, everything on my palm to try and help perform that motion.